Okay, we've been in Avodah Zarah. We started out with the first pages of Avodah Zarah. We were concerned about the place that Jews basically really inhabit in the world vis-a-vis the other nations who were hegemons and empire builders and people with great kinds of visions about expanding the world in their time, and whether or not they made a place for the Jewish people and the Torah of the Jewish people and learned anything from Torah as a canonical text towards, let's say, lawful society, let's say more moral society in the way that they understood morals in their age. They wanted to know. God wanted to know, but the rabbis wanted to know because they wrote God into the script. In the age of the Messiah, or the next age, whatever that Olam Haba would really be, or at a time that you're really having to give accounting, could you really see yourself arguing that you did what was righteous in the eyes of the God of the Jews? Now, that question is either the Jews wondering, did they do right by us, and did they have any kind of connection to our Torah and its scriptures? Meaning Torah and all of the different books of the Tanakh and all of the canon of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, of the Mishnah and the Talmudic argumentation at the time, Midrash Halacha being before the Talmud, the kind of Talmudic reasoning that was through oral culture evident in our study houses. And then we ourselves, there were questions. You saw it turn back on us. Did the Jewish people really live up to these standards? Were the Jewish people so inclined as to fulfill the very dictates of the Torah, the very underlying moral foundations of the text? What kind of attention do they give to the details, and what kind of memory do they have about God's goodness towards them? And the one mitzvah that we saw at the end of that sugya was sukkah. And whether or not sukkah is an easy mitzvah or a difficult mitzvah, on the very simplest level of it's a physically demanding mitzvah to do, it might, shine a little sunlight, too much sunlight if you don't have enough shade in that reality. And the general outlook is that even though the Jews aren't doing every little detail exactly right, God might give them a pass, and the peoples of the world too, that God ultimately comes out in that sugya a pretty merciful God. Because what's accounted for is the fact that they're kind of not hitting the mark with being able to put up the right sukkah. They have to run inside because it's too hot. And God says, sometimes it's just too hot. And I'll account for the fact that they really tried to do this. And that's kind of the buildup of the world as we know it is parallel, or metaphorically, the sukkah is used to talk about the buildup of the world. And we kind of stop there, and there's lots more to say if we would have continued with that passage on page 3 of Avodah Zarah. But let's just say that the world is shaky. The world is sometimes going to burn you. The world is sometimes going to be a place where you can remember the goodness granted you as a people, the history of God taking you out, and Hoshavti Echem B'nai Yisrael b'Sukkot, and I caused you to dwell in these Sukkot, and I protected you even in the flimsiest and the most fragile of structures. And so we get a lot of that dialogue going. It's dialogical, and we are warned about entering the world of the other and leaving Torah, or putting Torah in a kind of secondary place through a gutta, through this kind of beginning story that is more, again, the great drama of the courtroom. And we worry that we're going to be judged for how we live our lives. And we worry that we have a lot of temptation. And the other peoples of the world, while we argue whether they did good for the Jews or they did not so righteous kinds of civilization buildup, really the question is, are we building a civilization Are we building a society? Are we the ones who have a little bit of the secret sauce to make the recipe of building out the way that people and humanity should relate to each other, even if we don't get it, again, 100% right? And so what winds up happening is that there's toggling back and forth in the next pages of the tractate about a lot of transgressions that other people have to be careful about, but mostly that Jews have to be very careful about. And there are transgressions that are really related to the profit and the marketplace and a lot of temptations that come with money, a lot of temptations that come with idolatry itself, and the sinful nature of even the generation of the golden calf is brought forward, so that it's not just about, as we saw at the very beginning of the sugya we learned together, blaming others for putting vices or putting all kinds of terrible marketplaces in action, so that usury or so that bribes would be taken on at the court level as well. It's not just the other folks who are going to be prone to this, but it's you, Jewish people, who are going to be prone to this. And the business dealings with others based on the fact that they have a different religious faith comes into focus here and there again and again. And the dealings with the ruling authorities come into focus several times. So as I flip through pages 6 and 7, and we go forward, and we're still talking about festivals in the Mishnah on page 7, and what days we can do business and what days we don't. And then there's another Mishnah that says about particular festivals that we don't really celebrate them, but we understand on page 8 of Avodah Zarah, and I'm fast forwarding us because we're going to stick to Sugya and Avodah Zarah on page 17. We don't celebrate the days that they put on the calendar, and we mentioned this back in our Sugya, for the emperors. We don't become part of the great civil body of civilians that feel so indebted to the emperors of the realm that we believe that those become our days to celebrate. We separate ourselves calendrically. We separate ourselves culturally. We don't celebrate a human being, and we don't put up statuaries about our great leaders, as opposed to some of the busts of the Roman leaders and the statuary that comes all in the Roman Empire, and especially, you can go back to Grecian times, you can go back to Roman spaces, and these different kinds of honorific statues become, in a sense, for the rabbis, the very place to contrast between themselves as part of the natural world and people who need to make of stone something that is idolatrous. And there's still the question on page 10, though, when Antoninus comes to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who has a good relationship. Barry, you'd mentioned that we always remember that Antoninus has this good relationship with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. There's some nice connections between Jewish leadership and Roman leadership at the time, because there's some diplomacy that's going on. And he says, do I have a place in the world to come, or do I not have a place in the world to come? And that's on page 10. And it's a lovely kind of question, because it's actually an echo of the beginning sugya. And they're talking about what would get them a place in the world to come, and whether or not making space for Jews to do their thing in the kingdom is really a part and parcel. A divine voice emerged and said, so and so is destined for life in the world to come, and they wept. This idea that you're really doing something both for this world and you're doing something for the next world comes into focus in Avodah Zarah. And again, it's because perhaps this is all related to the mitzvot that we perform in this world, and we hope for some reward, despite the fact that we're told in other places that we shouldn't be working for a reward. in the cities where folks are engaged in active worship of idols, here it is, permitted to engage in business transactions with Gentiles who live outside of the city. But if idol worship is outside the city, it's permitted to engage in business within the city. So we're careful about the neighborhoods we live in as well. So let's talk neighborhoods, and let's talk about the first kind of situations for Jews where they say, you might want to think about where you're living, where you're going to build a house. You're moving out of the Lower East Side, you're moving a little east. Levittown sounds nice, but don't go so far. Don't go so far. There's no one in Suffolk yet. There's no one in Suffolk County. And who knows when the first Jews got to Port Jefferson Station? I don't know. But regard to a city in which idol worship is practiced, in which there are stores that are adorned for the sake of idol worship, and there are others that are not adorned. This was, in fact, an incident that occurred in Beit Sha'an, and the sages said, with regard to the adorned shops, it's prohibited to buy from them. But in the case of those that are not adorned, it's permitted. So I have to now navigate myself around the iconography and around the kind of both visualized pictures in addition to statuary, because at this time is the first times that they have frescoes in store shops are mentioned, which is a very interesting kind of use of art question within the Talmud that I came across this week as dedication, for somewhere between decoration and to sell. So we don't really know if they sold different hangings. They definitely painted on walls, according to some archaeological finds, because they figure that they're not part of mosaics, but they are part of potential storefronts that were mentioned right here in this Mishnah. And so some work on that has been done in the art departments and the historical departments. Someone's looking at that, I understand, in Ben Gurion University. There's Ars Judaica, that journal about the arts and Jewish life from decades ago, and now there's new writings. Sarah Offenbacher is a wonderful scholar who's got her finger on all these and holds day-long conferences and for Hebrew scholars, for Jewish and Hebrew-speaking scholars in these areas. So then what we get to is some more discussions in pages 14, 15. I'm not going to do this for every tractate, but I figure while we're turning to page 17 here, I'm going to give you the background of what came before we start into the next sugya. And they're worried now. What do they start to get worried about? Not just idol worship in the sense of their festivals, but how idol worship manifests within our own community. And they somehow mention a horse and riding a horse for the purpose of selling it and bringing it somewhere. But then there's a lot of discussion regarding the ideas of sabbatical years and comparing some of what is going on in Jewish calendrical reality to the basic calendar of the empire. And the interactions between Jews and non-Jews of animals gets them into questions of bestiality and the kind of eros, the kind of morality around eros that exists within that society that they're embedded in, and our own sense of what kind of laws and rules there are around relationships and sexual impropriety. And so what happens is that the laws around relationships and sexual impropriety are put in the Masechta. We have to think about context here, about idol worship. So the idea within the Gemara, I think in some ways, again, some people just say there's discursive discussions in the Talmud, and you always have to just take things at face value. And so if someone mentioned a verse that has some implication about the laws and rules of sexual relationships and family relationships and keeping a certain kind of sexual ethic or building a sexual ethic, so be it. They're going to bring that into the Talmud at that stage because they mentioned a verse that has everything to do with the subject. But sometimes and there are those teachers who would say they make very, very conscious decisions about where to place discussions, and they're placing a discussion around the ethos of the society vis-a-vis family relationships, sexual relationships, outlooks, desires of humanity vis-a-vis men to women mostly, because we're past the notion of bringing animals into the discussion by the time we get to our page 17. But there's going to be this mix of the discussion around relationships and the discussion of sages being dragged to trial by local hegemons. And that's an interesting juxtaposition. And in feminist critique, or at least in a very deeply lit crit kind of angle of the sugya, there's this notion that I can go back and forth between what's kosher about a relationship, or what's really an idolatrous way to look at a sexual relationship, or a woman who is a symbol of the sexual act, which is a prostitute, and she's used as a character in literature in a very interesting way, so that we have a tale or two in the Talmudic literature about prostitutes who challenge the sages to be more ethical, to not make sex into idolatry, to not make a woman who provides sex into an idol of sorts, and not to commit any crimes that make it as though you're so worshiping your evil instinct, or your urge or desire for the sexual act, that you would be ultimately punished and not achieve an ultimate good judgment in the time to come, and that God would condemn you to Gehenna or worse. You just wouldn't get your portion in the world to come if you committed these heinous acts and violated a woman and violated any kind of rule or law about sexual relationships. And it's put in this Masechta as a part of idolatry, so that we don't kind of objectify, according to this kind of pushing the literary critical theory about why this exists here, with the sages being kind of paralleling that to the arresting, to the sages being arrested for teaching Torah in public, or the sages being arrested for committing certain crimes that they won't, in essence, get into bed with the local ruling authorities. And so it's a dynamic that's going to come into focus more, I think, as we read the sugya, because I think I'm leaving it a little nebulous in the way I'm explaining, but there are relationships here being explored, and there's positioning in the Talmudic argumentation that the rabbis, or sages themselves, and then generally Jews, could really wind up living in a space of that marketplace of prostitution that they blamed on the ruling powers in the opening sugya that we just studied together. Or they can sanctify and make holy relationships with God, with a woman in front of them, even the prostitute, who becomes, by the way, a figure that represents in the Tanakh a potentially Ba'alat Tshuva, a woman who comes around and makes tshuva in order to embrace God and lead us towards fulfilling the promise of God. That's Rachav, right? Rachav is the famous prostitute in the book of Joshua who receives the men, who we know from the tradition is a prostitute. So every time we see that there are tales of prostitutes, we kind of relate to her, and she leads Joshua to the promised land and to ultimately fulfill the promise of God and the Jewish people and their relationship by having this house and home together, and that she ultimately becomes the ancestor of prophets, is a really essential trope that the rabbis have in the back of their minds that we're always remembering as we read about other prostitutes within. And by the way, I'm getting a little bit of this whole notion in the way we look at prostitute stories and the prostitute characters by a wonderful scholar who I happened to meet in person this summer when I was teaching at the Tikva Institute, the Scholars Institute, and her name is Gila Stern, and she presented all about different kinds of, really love stories and stories with prostitutes, and got us deeper into this figure, this kind of character, and what it could represent. As whether or not you think you can just overcome a woman just on that level alone, whether or not you can become the master of godly property and use it as you like. Can you make it into some kind of, worshiping of your urge and desire, or are you required to control it? And what does it mean that you, will kind of reject this notion of seeking that in the context of prostitution versus sacred marriage, and then the relationships that are kind of discussed adjacent to those stories. Are the relationships going right? Are they using you like a prostitute? Are you using them? Is there a defining relationship here that makes the relationship between you and the other, here in this case, the Roman authority, holy and potentially beneficial? Or is it one that is transactional, or even worse? Are they overcoming you and overpowering? So all that comes into play as we're going to start into this next section of the Gemara. And I'm going to bring up page 17 after a Mishnah that says that you're not allowed to contribute to the marketplaces where they kill wild animals, and we went through the whole wild animal trade the last time we studied this together, and we saw that Jews were brokers in wild bears and all kinds of lions and the wild animals that the Romans used in their stadiums, and they shouldn't build the kind of bathhouses and the kind of buildings in our communities that the rest of the community is building. And we're going to start on page 16b and go through probably 17b and see what's in store for us with that kind of very twisting and turning introduction here. Question or comment before I go on to clarify anything that I'm trying to suggest? I know before reading the text, it might sound a little unclear, but I think some of the connections, you can kind of tune into and just say, all right, what is that all going to look like? Yeah, Diane.
So I'm just interested in just the coincidence that in this week's parashah, we're going to read about Dinah. And I've talked about Dinah and being Dinah. The brothers justify their heinous acts with, should our sister be a whore? So we've got that, and we've got other stories in our canon that are untam, as far as I'm concerned. The beginning of the Haggadah, not the Haggadah, the Megillah, where Achashverosh is trying out each woman, and she goes back to the harem. I mean, we've got some really, to me, untam stories in our canon, and that just, this just brought this up to me.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, like towards realizing how misogynist some of them are read straightforwardly that way, we can say that. We can also hold it as a both and. We're faced with the very truth that we've made a lot of developments over the years, centuries, millennia, and look, we're just here now, wherever we are, right? Mm-hmm. And that took a long time. Two, we're also faced in the Tanakh in a way that Others might have been able to avoid it with a canonical text that actually showed you the folly of those ways. And so in a certain way, a text like the ones you're talking about worked like mirrors to say, what do we do when we're really confronted with this? What do we do if we do read it fully as a rape? What do we do with the notion that there is rape in the world, that it has been wielded like a weapon? And what are the procedures that ultimately we're going to have to put into place? The mechanisms of what will become statecraft. How do we respond to it today? We were just talking about it as we opened up the computer screen this evening for this class. We were talking about it before I think you got on, Diane. The idea that people are not believing these women, and the films and the sadistic terror that went on, and how people could be pro any of the sadists at this time in life, at this time in the world where we have the actual film is beyond. And so I think we were faced with that. Imagine a society that didn't have social media, that didn't have mass communications, that didn't have body cameras and DNA, but they were faced with it in the narrative of the Torah. So the way that we could read Dinah is a very radical story being told. And how often can you address that in that ancient theater? At least you have it right in the first book of Torah, and the farce of an Achashverosh, and the kind of political leader that he 127 provinces he probably inherited, and the kind of pageantry that he puts on with his party, and then to abuse women, is the beginning of his, if you will, somewhat downfall as any kind of leader with any kind of political power, and he's easily overtaken by a tyrant within his own administration, right? And that's where we get Haman. And Esther, she takes off the mask of her peoplehood. She doesn't strip down. So she's got this political savvy that's ultimately, whether orchestrated in cahoots with Mordechai or not, right? She's got a savvy. So I think it works a little bit like a positive mirror, those stories, as much as the fact that they're not really that tasteful at first. Yeah, Barry.
It's impossible for me to listen to this without thinking of Tamar and Judah, where we really have a very powerful story related to prostitution, or at least the assumption of prostitution, and how that plays out. I think that's one of the defining features, and the line is carried through Judah. So clearly, this is something to be reckoned with.
Absolutely, and the story of Tamar and Judah was going to come up later, because what's the context that we're going to get into in our passage in this section in the Sugya, but the idea that there's some type of tshuva possible in a story that highlights a prostitute.
Right, but who's tshuva?
Right, exactly. And so over there in the Torah, we're gonna contrast it.
The John.
And over here, so we'll see. Is it the same? Is it parallel? How's it not parallel? And so keep that in mind, folks, as that's another one of those that needs to be on the table. And we could have read it first, but we'll read it in the context of when that comes up more closely in the story we're gonna, I didn't want to read it the first night. I want to read it after we see some text in the Gemara. So very important. All right, anybody else before we get into the text? Okay. Now we may take some right turns and left turns, but don't worry, we're touching this drum kit that we now have put up, and we'll get there. Okay, here we go. Rich, I can see your face. You can see the text now? Yeah, good. Okay. I just want to show you here. We're on page 16b. So it says, Ein bonin. So they're very worried with what kind of physical structures you build. Architecture can be of the other. You know, I was just last night at a wonderful presentation of 4 excerpts from Ken Burns' 6.5 hours worth of the United States and the Holocaust documentary. And Ken Burns spoke to the audience about how important this film is in his oeuvre, and that he believes, and so does Steven Spielberg, believe the 6.5 hours of that film are the most important film for placing the United States in context when it comes to immigration, that there's as much anti-immigration as there is for immigration, and deepening everybody's understanding about anti-Semitism world over, and right now how essential it is. And one of the things that has been on other scholars' minds, and as he was talking about Berlin and being so shocked that it could happen in Berlin, that some of this policy could be made and law could be abused, etc., I thought about, at one point, Berlin really helped Jews assimilate and express their emancipation, because they gave Jews permission to build what were considered to be the Spanish revivalist synagogues, and the architectural kind of nod back to that age of the great, time of living together on the Iberian Peninsula. So it becomes, a dedication towards both Sephardic architecture and Sephardic Hebrew. And by the way, that's where a lot of modern, the kind of push towards Ashkenazim speaking Sephardic Hebrew really happens, because they kind of go back to that great age of Spain. They do a Moorish building project, which is that kind of style that was in the Iberian Peninsula from the early 1300s forward. They allow the Jews to acquire cultural expressiveness through their language. But then by about the 1880s, they're all fed up with it. Church makes the law completely against it, basically erases Jewish presence, says you can no longer build like this. You can't speak that language. There's no Jewish ritual in public, and you have to have every marriage sanctified by the church. And that's the very first, by the way, organization against anti-Semitism within a Jewish society in Western Europe or in a Western nation grows up in 1893 in that theater. And I'm thinking of this as they're speaking, and I'm remembering at that time that Ken Burns is pointing out that Ford is buying a newspaper and printing the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and Jews are really kind of saying at that time, when they're building some of the shuls, that they want to build in the Moorish style. So some of the shuls that are built around the turn of the century are Moorish, to kind of reflect what the hopes of the pre-anti-Semitic Germany was all about. And a few of them start to look a little bit like churches, because they want to blend into society in a way, though they are trying to keep some Jewish roots. And architecture in and of itself is part of what either says we're part of this world or we're not part of this world. And the rabbis were really concerned about it. And they said, Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shalosh Basilikayot hen shel melachim v'shel merchatzaot v'shel otzarot. There are 3 types of basilicas: those of kings, those of bathhouses, and those of storehouses. Rava shtayim leheter ve'echad leisur. You're allowed to build 2 of them, but you're not allowed to build 1 of them. V'siman le'esor machehem b'zikim. And we have a verse that comes in Psalms that says to bind their kings with chains. It's a mnemonic device for the ruling about what you can build and what you can't build within our own architectural space, within our own architectural reality that is part of the greater empire building that's going on within the Roman Empire. Ve'ikada amri amarava, and there are those who say that this is what Rava said. kulam laheter, that you're allowed to really build any of the kinds of structures that the rest of the world is building around you. Vahatanan, ein bonini mahem basilike, gargadom, itztadya uvima. But didn't we learn in the Mishnah that one may not build with them a basilica, a tribunal, a stadium, or a platform? Don't we have a separate world? Don't we have a kind of set up a good old courtyard, a modest place to pray? Do we need to be investing in this kind of buildup within a society? Ema, let's say, shel gardon v'shel itztadya v'shel bima. One may not build in conjunction with the Gentiles a basilica of a tribunal or a stadium or a platform, but is permitted to build a basilica that's not used for sentencing and inflicting the death penalty. So if you want to adopt a little bit of their style and live according to the way they live, a little bit, build in this case, a little bit the way they build, then maybe you should be able to build. Now, again, we're in Avodah Zarah and we're in the larger context of, shall we really engage with the styles around us? Shall we really create society in their image, or do we have an image of our own that we're going to pursue? And do we have an understanding of the general nature of humanity that is the same, or is it very different? And where is it the same and where is it different? And that's some of, again, what will come out here with all these different kinds of characters and all these different kinds of situations that I mentioned are about to come. So it goes and it turns to a story. That's a Braita, Tanu Rabbanan. They say in a Braita, Kashen nitpas Rabbi Eliezer leminut, he'eluhu legardom lidom. The sages taught that when Rabbi Eliezer was arrested and charged with heresy by the authorities, they brought him up to a tribunal to be judged. Now, a little bit of background here. They brought him up on heresy. The Romans treated religions they accepted with tolerance, and yet they did not recognize various sects that they deemed heretical, a category that included Christianity. These were considered forms of superstition and sorcery. And this was bolstered by the fact that many heretical sects were mystical in outlook and included sorcerous rites. And this becomes a little bit of a discussion about one of the actually first Yeshus named in the Talmud. Yeshu is the name Jesus, but it's really the name Joshua, according to most scholars. Peter Schaeffer at Princeton really wrote the book about Jesus in the time of the Talmud, or in the Talmud itself. So if you want to have a great reference book about Jesus in the Talmud, you'll see that Peter Schaeffer's book called Jesus in the Talmud is really the one to go to. And so the Jesus who's called the sorcerer, by the way, has been proven because of the time that he's associated with the trial that he's put on, not associated by scholars with the Jesus of Nazareth that becomes the main guy by the Christians. So there's lots of Jesus's name who are also considered not to be the main Jesus, and the Yeshu is probably a nickname for Joshua, but those who want to say that some of it is kind of reference to what Jesus was known for, but he's put in relationship with sages who lived before his time and who lived after his time to kind of hide what they're really against, and maybe what Jesus was really trying to practice at the time, to give us more of a look at what this guy who stole the hearts of so many was really involved with. So I mention all this because Yeshu is going to be mentioned on a page that's up on part of a sugya that's up and coming. And we're going to talk about, Steinsaltz is bringing it up in this note on this page, and that's what I'm reading you from when it comes to heresy, to understand what heresy is, because Yeshu is considered heretical to the Romans, as he is considered a real threat and heretical to standard Jewish outlooks at the time. And again, to clarify the question, even though it seems like we see Yeshu on the scene as a sorcerer and called Yeshu of even Nazareth, but he seems to be in dialogue with sages that live at times that the classical Jesus of Nazareth didn't live. are they putting him in the Gemara in these different the relationships with these sages as a little bit of, fictional meetings with these sages who disapprove so much of the activities that he's associated with, that the real Jesus was associated with, so that they can make the critical comments on Jesus without actually putting him on trial themselves. So that's the Jesus part. But here we have Rabbi Eliezer being arrested for what the Romans are against. And what Rabbi Eliezer says when he gets arrested is, he says, Amarlo, ho'il v'he'emanti alecha, dimos, patorata. He says, since you've put your trust in me, v'he'emanti alecha, you put your trust in me, Demos, you are acquitted. Interesting. We'll look at that note as well from Rabbi Steinsaltz in a second on the word demos. Patorata, right? What does pator mean? You're not guilty. You're exempt from any liability. So what did he think? Well, this arresting officer thinks that he's talking about him. What Rabbi Eliezer was saying is that he's basically he says, hold on one second, I'll just get the note. He's basically saying, I have a certain trust that God is really behind me, that I'm being trusted with whatever the messaging is that I'm saying here, that I have truth to tell, and that whatever the tribunal is going to do, it's really not the ultimate judge of the earth. It's really, I've been trusted by God. So Rabbi Eliezer says to him, Amar lo, ne'eman alai adayan, the judge is trusted by me to, in essence, rule correctly. Kasavor oto hegemon alav hu omer v'hu lo amar ela keneged aviv shebashamayim. And here's where it says explicitly right here that the officer thought Rabbi Eliezer was speaking about him, and in fact, he speaks only about God in heaven. Amar lo ho'il v'he'emanti alecha dimos paturata. Kishe ba leveto nichnesu talmidav etzlo. So when Rabbi Eliezer comes home, his students enter to console him. What was the question up above that we didn't read? Amar lo oto hegemon zaken shekamotcha yasok b'devarim b'teilim halalu. Should a certain elder like you engage in frivolous matters of heresy? So what was it that got them all in a funk, and that the officer arrests him and they think that a sage of Israel is dealing with some kind of heretical practice? Most commentators think that he was trying to ultimately play with the ideas that were in the marketplace and say, oh, this is what I hear from the heretics. Let me tell you what that idea is really all about. How did they get there, and how are we in our outlooks able to prove them wrong, or what answer might we give? In other words, it's this kind of reality that he's speaking in a way that's dialogical with what ideas that are very, very threatening to the Romans. Both Jewish ideas start to become threatening, and for sure Christian ideas start to become threatening, and the sorcery going on at the time is threatening. And the students come and they say, I can't believe you were accused of heresy. Rebbe, really? Like, what was going on? They want to know too. Like the students flock to him right away. So just think about that moment where they heard that he's actually brought up on charges of heresy, and he's ultimately let go, obviously, because he comes home in the story. And they say, what's going on here? V'lo kibel av tanchumim. And he did not accept any words of consolation. Amarlo Rabbi Akiva's there. The great Rabbi Akiva is there. And he says, Rabbi, my teacher, because we see who Rabbi Eliezer is. He's the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. Tarsheni lomar davar echad mima shelimadatani. Would you permit me to say one teaching from what you taught me? Amarlo, and more. He says to him, all right, tell me. Interesting, by the way, in terms of Gemara's rhetoric, that you need the rabbi to say, please go ahead and say it, as opposed to the next sentence just being the statement of what he learned from his master. So there is this pause. There is this pause for permission. There is this respect. There is this kind of place of a student vis-a-vis the master. And I just think it's very interesting. You know, when I once read a piece when they were writing scripts for some of these kind of science fiction and medieval films, and the ones that are more like the great saga stories, Dune or Star Wars, that they use this kind of rhetoric between master and student. You know, may the students speak, my master, kind of thing. Well, that's very much part of the master-disciple structures within Talmudic literature and with some other Near Eastern literature that's pre-Talmudic times and other literature of the times when you have master-disciple literature. And it's just this kind of wonderful little moment of noticing what's in the script, because it could have just been, let me say one thing. And then Rabbi Akiva, who's known as a great, could have just been introduced with what he said, but he says, Amor, please say, Amarlo, Rabbi, Shema minut, Bali adecha, Hinacha, Va'alav nidpasta. Rabbi Akiva says, Master, perhaps some statement of heresy did come before you, and you really enjoyed it. You really felt inspired by it. Amarlo, Akiva, he's Kartani. You're right. I think I did hear something, and I really got excited about the idea. Once I was in the upper marketplace of Tzipori, umatzati adam echad mitalmidei Yeshu hanotzri, and there I found one of the students of Jesus the Nazarene, v'Yaakov ish kafar Sochnaye shemo, and his name was Yaakov of Kfar Shechanya. And he said to me, Amarli, katuv b'torat chem, notice the chem, it's written in your Torah, sounds like the wicked child in the Haggadah, lo tavi etnan zonah, you shall not bring the payment of a prostitute. Mahu la'asot heimenu beit hakisei l'chaim gadol. What if the prostitute actually donated the proceeds of that act of sex and copulation and that act of zunut, that act of prostitution? What if she donated it to the temple and they wanted to build a bathroom for the Kohen Gadol? Could I use it to build the Kohen Gadol's outhouse? Velo amarti lo klum. And I said nothing to him in response. V'amar li, and he said to me, here's how Jesus calls that Torah. Here's how Jesus paskins that question. Kach limdani Yeshu anotzri. This is what Jesus the Nazarene taught me. Ki me'etnan zona kibatza va'ad etnan zona yeshuvu. For the payment to a prostitute, she's gathered them, and to the payment to a prostitute, they shall return. Mimakom hatinofet ba'u, lemakom hatinofet yelchu. Since the coins came from a place of filth, let them go to a place of filth. Oh, now let's stop there for a minute. So first of all, you have to understand there's one version of the Gemara over here that has this. Let's take the characters first. You see, Yeshua Notzri is here, and it's now a story about Jesus of Nazarene, and he's mentioned again as a Torah teacher of sorts, a teacher of the faith, upending different, either upending teachings of the rabbis or actually giving answers when the rabbis don't really have any yet, because there has to be a lot more learning. Like, what does it mean? Lo amar lo klum. He didn't say anything to him. It means I got to check in here with colleagues. I got to really flesh this out. I got to have my own thoughts about the verse that we might use. I got to have other colleagues chime in. I don't know the answer right away. Right?
That wasn't my.
What was yours?
No, I thought that he's feeling guilty that he didn't say anything because he's confronted with something that he should have had immediate moral response.
Could be. He could have been feeling ashamed. He also could have been not engaging, right? Like this guy comes up to him and says, "Can you make a toilet out of, prostitutes' proceeds?" Right? Like, I'm not even going to bother entertaining that question. I'm not going to give you any credence whatsoever.
But I'm just saying that with a lead in where he says, I remember once I really did do this.
Yeah, but that's the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Because Akiva says maybe you really got some hana'ah. But what kind of pleasure does he get from hearing the answer of Jesus? Maybe he feels the pleasure, here's the pure answer, of Jesus who made a Devar Torah. And he knows he's still like one of them. Or maybe he has pleasure in understanding the actual drush and thinks, wow, that's a really solid way of understanding the verse. Or maybe he has pleasure because it's a way of really insulting the Kohen. And the rabbis themselves have a really fraught relationship with the kahuna and the temple. And maybe that's the reason behind it. So there's a whole lot of possibility here. If any more come up for you, share. But there's a lot of it. And here he says, "V'hin ani adavar." I derive pleasure from the statement. Al yedei zeh nitpasti leminut. And he doesn't say exactly what he so enjoyed. But he says, due to this, I was arrested for heresy by the authorities, because here I was sitting with this guy who was probably a well-known teacher of Torah in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, the Nazarene. Vavarti al mashakatu b'Torah, but I know I was arrested, and then I transgressed what's written in the Torah. Harchek me'aleha darkecha. Remove your way far from her. This is what? What's the her? A reference to heresy. To heresy. And by the way, I think you're right, Barry. It's a double entendre. I can't even begin to think about the morality that might come with a prostitute in any which way, shape, or form. Though I have the trope that I remember that it was the prostitute Rachav who had enough power to see godliness and make tshuva and help the two to become warriors for Hashem, to take the land, to make the covenantal relationship with God first and foremost, and not stay by her during the night and have a whole story of lying in the prostitute's lair. And here he is, zo minut. Here it is. What is it? Minut, though. They say it's heresy in the Gemara. It's not prostitution. It's not zanut. It's minut. Va'al tikrav el petach beta, zo harashut. And don't come near the entrance of her house. This is a reference to the ruling authority. And so the ruling authority in this case is the one that potentially, do they see that the ruling authority is somehow connected to Jesus the Nazarene? Or is it the ruling authority as in the Romans, and that's just a learning of the verse that's going to relate to the rulers, the Roman rulers, who they are contending with in a general sense? And I want to get back to that in a second, because some texts don't have Jesus's name. They have a different name for who teaches this Torah. So hold on. There are those who say, distance yourself from her, from her way, zo minut v'harashut, that's both heresy and the ruling authority. V'al tikrav el petach beita, and don't go close to the entrance of her house. This is prostitution or a prostitute. V'chama amar Rav Chisda arba amot, and I literally have to distance myself 4 amot from the house of a prostitute. I have to seriously distance myself. There's that's not
Very far.
it's not very far, but it's like
From here to here.
exactly. So yeah, like 4 yards, or even less. So just to finish that piece up, the Rabbanan, with regard to the derivation of the verse that we learned earlier, that was said in the name of Yeshu, Hai me etnan zona. What do the sages derive from this payment to a prostitute? My darshi be. What do they really say that really means? Ki de Rav Chisda de Amar Rav Chisda, as Rav Chisda teaches, kol zona sheniskeret, any prostitute who hires herself out, levasof hi socheret, in the end, she ultimately hires people when she can no longer sell herself. She hires people for the sexual act, and actually becomes a client, a John herself, in the prostitution ring. Shenemar uvititech etnan ve'etnan lo nitan lach utehi lehefech. In that you gave payment, and no payment's given to you. Therefore, you are contrary. In other words, you now have to be the one to pay for it, even though before you got paid for it. And so, one thing before I take your question, Ari, and just to say, if it wasn't Yeshu Anotzri, because the Gemara here is saying, don't relate to heretics and don't relate to the Reshut. What's the other possibility of who teaches this? It says, Zaken echad mehem. There's a Gemara that has an elder or a sage from them. And because it's either an elder or a sage from the clan of Yeshu, or a different heretical sect, or from the ruling authority, that's where you get both minut and reshut. That's why you have this kind of discussion about the both of them, because we're not really sure if it's Yeshu, because we have a different version of the Gemara. Another position about that is, though, that it is indeed Yeshu. Excuse me. Maybe the rabbis at this point in this sugya are relating to Yeshu and the Nazarenes as some kind of ruling authority, or they're just nodding to the fact that you're not supposed to go to the ruling authority's ways, even though this story didn't necessarily say that anyone was buying any of the ideas. And they ultimately get it down to this prostitution thing, because they want to say what the cyclical nature is. If you let life go towards being involved with prostitution, that ultimately, you pay for it, and then you'll receive proceeds, but you'll then have to buy yourself, and you're just caught in a vicious cycle of debauchery and what it means in and of itself as prostitution. And I think what they're really trying to nod at is that it's kind of like they don't want to be in this relationship with anyone where they kind of receive profit and make a decent living, but then have to pay it all back in a kind of taxable kind of way. And so they see that as a cyclical thing to avoid when it comes to the reshut, the ruling authorities. And the rabbis will say that as long as if you took their money in the marketplace, in the end, you'll pay it back in either taxes or fines, depending. And so there's this whole kind of trope about business going on here with the ruling authorities that we have to consider. All right, so let's stop here and just up to there. Ari, you had your hand up in the midst.
Yeah, the argument with Rabbi Shimon about using the prostitute's money for building the toilet is probably just theoretical, because this happened post the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an interesting kind of historical remembering going on sometimes in the Tannaitic age.
It's the second temple.
Yeah, it's Second Temple times.
Yeah, Rabbi Akiva was 2nd century. So
I mean, so what? Yeah, so what you get is a historical remembering with characters who have an interest in kind of hearing what the questions were at the time and how they might adjudicate matters given their status as the sages of the Jewish people. But right, but the question is, Rabbi Akiva lives at the time of the temple. He passes it by with his colleagues and he laughs. Remember, there's lots of stories about Rabbi Akiva seeing the ruins of the temple and he's laughing, and he's living post temple for sure. But he sees the ruins and he laughs and he says, just like we were told we were going to cry, so too one day the prophet says we're going to laugh and it's going to be restored. So this is in their mindset. They're figuring out the relationship they have with the temple, and it's part of Tannaitic culture to relate back to the Kahuna and the questions about the Kahuna, and that's where for sure they take it with this interface with Yeshu. Yeshu, of course, that in the New Testament or the Christian Bible, he is really completely either at the beginning of his life or later in his life critical of the entire temple system. Now, the argument in the Gospels among scholars about the Gospels is whether or not Jesus, the historical figure, does that earlier on in his career, or he only does that much later on in his career. And the people who do the comparisons within the Christian Bible are not convinced either which way yet. So, but here we have, anyway, it doesn't matter whether it was earlier or later, we have a kind of insult about what kind of place it is, unless he's just kind of saying the Kohen Gadol is a human being too, and the money went to this function in life, the money went to that function in life, so let it be used for either one. You're not going to ever get away from the fact that we're just human beings down here, and nobody's a god, nobody's a gadol. But again, did he want to improve the temple, or did he want to completely see the eradication of the temple? That's another question that we have to ask. He was for sure against the rabbis too, and the Pharisees being the progenitors of the rabbis. So that's the historical memory that's all coming forward here, even though we're not back at that time when the Gemara is finally put together. And I can't tell you, Ari, when exactly this sugi is written and when it was stitched together. If it was, the last strata of the 7th and 8th centuries CE, or whether or not it's truly, reportage from that time of the oral tradition that's brought forward. It is Tanu Rabbanan. We do say it's a Braita. So that lends credence to the fact that it was remembered directly from the time that could have been at the turn before the destruction of the temple and brought forward, despite some of the characters, now and then being alive at questionable dates. We kind of remember them within this context of the story so that we can put them in the conversation and to adjudicate matters. But I'm not sure about everybody's dates, particularly within that realm. We can say about Rabbi Akiva, by the way, Akiva's dates. Let's ask. When did Rabbi Akiva live?
He was part of the Bar Kokhba.
Yeah, so that's 127. But I don't remember what they give him as a birthday. I don't remember which date they give him as a birthday. I brought the trusty, encyclopedia of our sages. So hold on. I happen to think about these rabbis too in the same way that you are, though I didn't get to read all of their introductions. And where's Rabbi Akiva? Akiva, here he is, 116. And we're going to go to him. And I think because we're not sure of his date, which often happens in this encyclopedia, we don't really get a full set of dates. Yeah, this scholar is not really putting down particular dates. So
Next week.
Tannaitic age, we'll look more and at who feigns to say what Rabbi Akiva's birthday was. Okay, Diane.
Many years ago, I was on grand jury duty and I learned a lot of interesting things. Among them is that the way that the authorities shut down houses of prostitution is money laundering. And I just find that interesting in light of what we've been discussing.
Hmm.
You mean they
It's money
prosecute-
laundering.
They prosecute them on money laundering.
Right, exactly.
So say more. What do you find interesting?
Well, the fact that the question is, so can you use the money from prostitution to build a bathhouse? Or, you know, a bathroom can you use the money from prostitution to do anything? And you can get the way that the authorities prosecute houses of prostitution in this day and age is they get them on money laundering.
Nice. So yeah, I mean, the foundational question of can you use monies made by prostitution or the prostitution ring for anything, I think really is at the core of this, right? It really is. And when he says nothing, you know, the question is, why did he so enjoy it? You know, what did he get? What kind of hana'ah did he really get? You know, and that's the piece here. Like, is it because we found a way to make vice into some kind of then redemptive act of building that, dedicating that outhouse? Did he think it was for the fact that we could turn it into something holy, or again, was it because it sounded like an insult over here? Yeah.
According to Wikipedia, Rabbi Akiva is from 50 CE to September 28th, 135.
Yeah. So you heard that Barry found 50 to 135, and there's debate about whether or not it's 50 or not, which is why the Encyclopedia of Sages doesn't have any dates for him.
But I want to generalize a little bit more from this, because I think it raises the question of all philanthropy to religious institutions, and what are the boundaries for accepting money from when you have concerns about the sources of the money and the way in which the money was made. And I was wondering, do you in JTS, do they discuss this issue? Is this something rabbi, or is this sort of each rabbi has to contend with this herself or himself? Are there norms?
Well, look, I don't know in JTS. I wasn't there for school, so I can't tell you. I can tell you what we learned at Ziegler.
Yes.
I could tell you that we learned one tshuva about a certain individual who makes some very, very interesting decisions in his life and happens to name a high school in Los Angeles. And what would we say if we were the Beit Din? And what do you do now that the school has taken all that money, invested it, pays teachers, has named seats, chairs?
The Bugsy Siegel High School of Jewish Studies. Yes.
So it was a very interesting kind of exercise to see if we could make it right. And if it was that we wanted to make it right, was it a communal responsibility to make it right? And did you need to go raise as much money as was donated to begin with in order for everybody to then keep the institution going? That was such a great institution. Because if you were going to demand that the money not be, kind of kept because it was tainted, what are you saying about the positive impact that school could make and does make on the community? So very interesting. One shul though, one tshuva that exists I believe it's in the Achve Da'at, which is Rav Ovadia Yosef's son, put together multi-volumes of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's halachic responsa. There's a piece about whether or not a table cover that has the name of an individual embroidered on it that was donated to a shul could be removed permanently because the individual was convicted of a crime. And the answer was absolutely yes. That you don't have the known criminal's name on the Torah reading table's mappa. You don't have it on the cover. And so there are certain tshuvot over time that have related to this. The same way that if someone owed a lot of money, they were not allowed to put a name of a loved one on a wall until they settled their debts in the Middle Ages, which is some of, I believe, again, I've not read these in a long time, but you're jogging my memory. I believe that's Professor Katz's presentation, or it could be Daniel Sperber in Minhagei Yisrael, but I would have to really check that out. First Dale and then Ron.
A couple of things. I always assumed when I read this story the first time, at least, that the pleasure came from the activity that is so similar to what goes on in the study house, that the exchange of legal discussions with a viewpoint that he hadn't heard before. But a little off your main topic, you commented about Akiva asking permission to speak, which that relationship was there, but in this particular case, it's not that common that the students ask permission. And it seemed to me that he was being very careful to make sure that he got his teacher to listen to him and not just to blurt out his thought, make his teacher angry and shut him down. And this story, I've always connected this story with the story of the Achna, because at the end of that story, it's Akiva who has to go to Rabbi Eliezer and tell him that he's been excommunicated. And if here he asks for permission to speak, in that story, he sits 4 cubits. I don't know if there's that relates to this, but he sits 4 cubits away and doesn't say anything. And it's Rabbi Eliezer who has to ask him, who understands what's going on from the way you stress, from the fact that he didn't say hello, that he sat 4 cubits away. And if I remember correctly, he invites Rabbi Akiva to speak. So these two stories resonate with some of the details and how they've gotten flipped.
How nice! How nice! Let's learn that story. Let's learn that story the next time I'll find it, because I think you're right about the details and the intertextuality that you're bringing forward. So that's lovely. Number one. Number two, I think that the hana'ah from hearing Torah, despite the fact that it was from Yeshu, that even led to his maybe thinking, he may be just one of us, that it's closer than we think. That's somehow like an enjoyable or a little bit of a fanciful idea that he did get hana'ah from, and that he just knows, though, that he's supposed to distance himself from it. It becomes clear in the argumentation here, and I think that there's something about this, like you said, this rhetorical device that said, listen, let me just ask you, because maybe Akiva knew him well enough to know that he kind of enjoyed this interaction and this interfacing with this kind of new group on the scene and some of their religious ideas, and that was supposed to be something that they were, at that point at least, really distanced from. And I would say that piece of a cultural productivity, to be really in your own groove and not so much in dialogue with the other religious ideas around. That's part of what's going on here. And when they excommunicate him and he's not part of the Beit Midrash experience of designing anew based on Torah learning, and here he loves the way that Torah is being interpreted. Over there, he can't stand for, I guess, the way that it was interpreted by that other group of sages, and ultimately he's going to get excommunicated, right? So there's an interesting piece of that too, like how far does Torah go? Who has the right to interpret Torah? And all of that intertextually comes into view based on those details that you pointed out, Dale. So good, so really good. Ron and then Bobby.
I think there is a Jewish concept that you cannot take the right of anyone to come in front of God or support God's will in any way they want. And I don't know why here they push it away.
Well, I don't know that the rabbis are so generous as to say all coming close to God and interpretations of Torah are acceptable. I think there's a certain borderline reality, and there's certain members of a community that can be members of the reading community and others who were seen by the rabbis as pushing the boundaries too far. And so I think that's what we're really in the midst of. We're really in the midst of all of that dialect.
Yeah, but that's opened the door to politics of certain group of people who control or leader in the community to be against other people in the community.
Yeah, and we live with distinctions and differences, and they're not afraid of that. They're not afraid of saying that there's a Jewish way of interpreting a text, and that there's one reshut. You can't say that there's two reshuyot, for instance, that one that makes good and one that makes evil. The Zoroastrians have it wrong, according to the rabbis. It's not a matter of allowing for them to come to their God or their gods in a way that they would like to, because when Isaiah says that God is the creator of good and evil, and there's only one God, that's what they believe in the end, that all nations of the earth will really come to realize that. And that's not to say that we were going to go on a crusade. It's not to say that we were going to completely eradicate, except sometimes we actually did get commands to eradicate, certain religious ideas that people embodied, and thusly the peoples who did embody them, we were to move off of the sacred land that would become a home and a house for a people who had a covenantal relationship with God, who could become the Or LaGoyim, again, prophetic language. So we're not so innocent when it comes to the idea that we have a way of reading and we have a way of rejecting some others' reading, despite the fact that we might find a lot of space in a more universalistic Jewish mode of living, or a universalistic outlook for multiplicity of faith-based approaches in the world. And so it's a both and by way of especially modernity. And again, it's why in a lot of anthologies, I explained to you with the first sugi of Avodah Zarah, it's not in a lot of anthologies, and neither are sugiyas like this that kind of contrast us to the Christians, except, the great scholar Peter Schaeffer. And in modernity, interfaith and Jewish Christian relations have been really explored to the depths in order to say, where are we similar, and yet where are we entirely dissimilar? And if you could do that in a civil way versus Crusaders versus the Jews kind of way, it's much better for us in the end. So I think that's the point that we want.
So in this way, you are stopping from people to come b'tshuva. If you push those people who made crimes from being close to the house, the temple, or being close to God, you don't allow them to come back b'tshuva.
Listen, you're onto something, because some people think that some of the stories about Yeshu in the Talmud actually make evident that Yeshu's teacher pushed him away too hard and fast when he was such a akshan, when he was such a stubborn student who had so many different ways of looking at things, like some of our little lovelies in whether it's Hebrew school or day school or our lives as parents. And because they pushed him away so deeply, that he actually created a whole different movement that took the world by storm, and we could have had him like, we could have had him as one of the top genius rebbes if we just would have given him a chance to be the radical Torah student that he was. So that's actually a theory in there, Ron, that you're seeing, that comes out of reading this together, comes out of reading passages like this one together, and thinking about the relationships between masters and disciples, which we saw at the end with Akiva and Eliezer, and we saw Yeshu, and we saw the Nazarene, the student of the Nazarene, deliver the Devar Torah, but it was a radically different Torah than we were ready to receive. Maybe, or maybe it was so enjoyed by Eliezer, again, that it was all in the realm of thinking, wait a minute, how different are we? Bobby.
Yes, so I'm thinking that Rabbi Akiva is like the first psychiatrist. Because I think asking that question, maybe you got pleasure to somebody who is a superior and who you shouldn't, he asked permission for it. But that's a very psychological thing to do, is to probe why someone has a reaction like that and say, maybe it's because you actually had pleasure from it, which is kind of forbidden. And I think it's interesting that it is embedded within this whole thing about prostitution and pleasure from something that is forbidden. He's really not supposed to get pleasure from things from Jesus and what they are proposing, but there is this kind of forbidden pleasure, and Rabbi Akiva is making a very interesting observation about someone. And usually with psychiatrists and psychologists, if you hit on it, the person says, oh yeah, maybe you're right. And he hit on it because he says, yeah, I think you're right. I didn't think of it that way before.
Well, it's a good note to end on. I'll say, Bobby, I think that probing, and to put it in the framework of psychiatry, and to show that he's really interested in the psyche of his teacher, and he really was someone who could probe so deeply, and that it was kind of roots of the tickling of his soul and trying to figure out what really makes this man tick. Like, that's a beautiful thing. And that if sages or our partners or chevrutas can be a little bit into that mode because of, what the Gemara's rhetoric brings forward, and then we practically create the whole field of psychiatry. If you ask some people, that really is an extension.
Permission when we're doing something like that. He could have gotten
Yeah,
very angry with him.
definitely.
But he asked permission because he knew this was going to be kind of touchy.
It's lovely. There's a wonderful book I'll commend to you called Jews and the American Soul by a scholar named Heinze. And in there, he says how deeply the whole Talmudic culture of the Jews influenced the way that modernity relates to people's minds and souls, and the field of psychiatry and psychology and therapy and probing of mental status really is impacted by the Jewish tradition. I'm not sure he makes the direct connection with AvodahZarahpp17-18, as you are, but it's really a cool book. So, folks, that's it for tonight.